Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Stain found Deku first. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world had been muted. Colors seemed to drain from the sky, the vibrant hues of late afternoon sun bleeding into a uniform, oppressive gray that mirrored the hollow space in Izuku Midoriya's chest. The sounds of the city, usually a chaotic symphony of life and ambition, were a dull, distant roar, like the sea heard from inside a seashell. He walked on autopilot, his feet scuffing against the pavement, each step a testament to the leaden weight that had settled in his soul. In his hand, he clutched the remains of his dream. The notebook. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, was a pathetic relic now. Its pages were warped and stiff from the water used to douse the flames, the edges charred to black lace. The ink of his meticulous notes had bled into abstract, mournful Rorschach blots. The heroic visage of All Might he had so painstakingly drawn on the cover was now a singed, grinning mockery. He had retrieved it from the koi pond with a sort of numb reverence. Bakugo's casual cruelty, the explosion, the toss from the window, the sneering advice to take a swan dive off the roof, felt like it had happened a lifetime ago. It was a shallow cut compared to the gaping, mortal wound that had been delivered just moments ago on a windswept rooftop. It's not bad to dream. But you need to be realistic, kid, All Might's voice. Not the booming, confident baritone from the television, but a thin, tired rasp that carried the weight of a terrible secret and an even more terrible truth. The words echoed in the cavern of Izuku's mind, each syllable a fresh tremor that threatened to bring the last of his crumbling hope crashing down. He could still feel the phantom pressure of his idol's hand on his shoulder, a gesture meant to be kind but that felt like a brand of judgment. He could still see the steam rising from the hero's skeletal frame, a frame that was a secret kept from the world, much like Izuku's own powerlessness. For a fleeting, foolish moment he had thought that shared vulnerability, that shared secret, might create a bond. A connection. He'd poured out his heart, his life's singular, desperate ambition. Can I be a hero without a quirk? The silence that followed had been a universe of its own, cold and empty. And then the answer, gentle but absolute, had shattered it. No, that single word was a guillotine. It severed the thread of hope he had clung to for 14 agonizing years. It invalidated every notebook, every minute spent watching hero fights, every mumbled analysis, every prayer whispered into the dark. All of it, a child's fantasy. All of it meaningless. The pros at the sludge villain incident had said as much with their eyes. Pity. Annoyance. Disdain. There was no need for you to put yourself in danger. Kamui Woods had chided, his voice a sharp reprimand. Izuku's legs had moved on their own. He hadn't thought. He had seen the pleading, desperate terror in Kaken's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him with contempt his entire life, and his body had reacted. He hadn't saved him, not really. He had only bought a few seconds. A few desperate, useless seconds before All Might arrived to do what a real hero does. And what had been his reward? A scolding from the heroes, mockery from the crowd, and the final, crushing condemnation from the one person whose opinion mattered. He was a failure. A quirkless, useless Deku. He had always known it, but he had allowed the faintest glimmer of a lie to keep him warm. Now, that lie was extinguished, and the cold was absolute. He absently touched the strap of his yellow backpack. The weight of it, usually a familiar comfort, now felt like a burden. Everything did. He rounded a corner, his gaze fixed on the cracked sidewalk, not wanting to see the bright, smiling faces on the advertisements, not wanting to see the children playing with nascent quirks, flaunting the very thing that made him less than human in the eyes of the world. A shortcut. An alleyway between a dilapidated pachinko parlor and a grimy ramen shop. It was dark, smelling of stale grease and damp concrete. Normally, his mother's warnings would have screamed in his head, "Stay on the main road, Izuku! It's safer!" But safety didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The darkness of the alley felt appropriate. It was a fitting path for someone whose future had just been snuffed out. He turned into it without a second thought, the gloom swallowing him whole. From the rooftop across the street, Kaizo Makaguro watched the boy disappear into the shadows. He had been watching for some time. Perched like a gargoyle amidst the air conditioning units and rusted satellite dishes, he was a creature of the city's forgotten heights, a predator surveying his corrupted hunting grounds. He had seen the entire, pathetic spectacle earlier. The sludge villain's rampage was a symptom of the disease he sought to cure, a low-level piece of filth, empowered by his own malice, holding the city hostage. And the so-called heroes, on the scene? Vultures circling a carcass, waiting for the most opportune moment to strike for the cameras. Kaizome's gaze, honed by years of rage and ideological purity, had dissected them with contemptuous ease. Kamui Woods, posturing at the edge of the police line, his wooden limbs useless against the villain's fluid form. A specialist, impotent outside his narrow niche. Death Arms, all bluster and brawn, bellowing orders but accomplishing nothing, his strength a useless tool. And Mount Lady, the newest darling of the media, more concerned with her debut and the angle of the news helicopters than the life hanging in the balance. They were fakes. Frauds. Parasites clinging to the title of hero. Motivated by fame, fortune, and the adulation of a blind and foolish populace. They were the sickness. He had been about to turn away in disgust, to add their names to a long, blood-soaked list of future targets, when it happened. From the crowd of gawking sheep, a small form had broken free. A schoolboy. Scrawny, terrified, and utterly, hopelessly outmatched. Kaizome had narrowed his eyes, his interest piqued by the sheer irrationality of the act. The boy had a backpack, no discernible quirk, and legs that trembled so hard Kaizome could see it from half a block away. And yet he ran. He ran towards the monster, towards the certain death that had made a dozen costumed professionals hesitate. He'd screamed, a pathetic, desperate cry, and thrown his school bag. An act of pure futility. But it had struck the villain in the eye. A distraction? A momentary opening. The boy had then begun to claw at the sludge, his small hands digging desperately, trying to free the explosive brat trapped within. In that moment, Kaizome saw something he had not seen in a very, very long time. It was not power. It was not skill. It was not confidence. It was the raw, unrefined, and utterly pure essence of heroism itself. It was the instinct to save, divorced from any possibility of reward or even survival. The boy was not trying to win. He was not trying to be famous. He was simply trying to help, because someone was in danger. His body moved before his terrified mind could stop it. That was the fire. The ember of a true hero, glowing in the heart of a society drowning in lukewarm mediocrity. Then, of course, All Might had arrived. The symbol of peace. Kaizome held a complex, almost reverent respect for All Might. He was, by Kaizome's own stringent criteria, a true hero. He saved people not for the money, but because it was the right thing to do. He was a pillar. But he was a pillar holding up a rotten, termite-infested structure. His very existence allowed the fakes to flourish in his shadow, like weeds at the base of a great oak. Kaizome had watched All Might handle the situation with his usual overwhelming force. He had watched him give his interviews, his smile a blinding beacon of manufactured hope. And then, he had seen him leap away, with the foolish, heroic boy clinging to his leg. Curiosity had become a focus, burning intensity. He had followed. His movements were silent, economical, flowing across the rooftops like a ghost. He arrived at the building just in time to see the symbol of peace deflate, both literally and figuratively. He had heard the boy's desperate plea, and he had heard All Might's soul-crushing answer. No, the word had hung in the air, a poisoned dart striking the very ember Kaizome had just witnessed. From his vantage point, he saw the boy's entire world collapse. He saw the light in his eyes extinguish. The symbol of peace, the one true hero, had just snuffed out the potential of another. He had reinforced the lie of the system, that worth is determined by power, that heroism is a profession for the gifted, not a calling for the worthy. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. And in that moment, Kaizome Akaguro, the man the world would come to fear as the hero killer, Stain, made a decision. He would not let that ember die. He would seize it, protect it from the corrupting influence of this fraudulent society, and fan it into a conflagration that would burn the old world down. He watched the boy stumble away from the building, a walking ghost. He followed him, a shadow trailing a shadow, waiting for the perfect moment. The boy's turn into the dark alley was the invitation he had been waiting for. He dropped from the fire escape into the alley's mouth, his worn boots making no more sound than a dead leaf falling on soft earth. The hunt was over. The lesson was about to begin. The alley was a claustrophobic canyon of brick and filth. A single, caged light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. The air was thick with the stench of rotting garbage and stagnant water. A fat rat scurried from beneath a dented, overflowing dumpster, its claws scratching on the slick pavement before it vanished into a crack in the wall. Izuku didn't notice. He was a million miles away, trapped in the replay loop of his own failure. He reached the middle of the narrow passage, where the shadows were deepest, and his legs finally gave out. He slid down the grimy brick wall, his backpack making a soft thud beside him. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his arms. A sob caught in his throat, a ragged, ugly sound. It was the first one he'd allowed himself. He hadn't cried in front of Bakugo, or the heroes, or All Might. But here, in the anonymous dark, the dam broke. Tears soaked the fabric of his uniform sleeve. It wasn't a cry of simple sadness. It was a cry of mourning for a life he would never live, for a dream that was now and forever out of reach. He was nothing, a joke. The world had confirmed it in triplicate today. Scrape. The sound was soft, but it cut through the haze of his misery like a razor. Metal on stone. Izuku's head shot up. He wiped his eyes, his body tensing with a primal, instinctual fear. The city's dull roar seemed to have vanished. The alley was suddenly, unnervingly silent. The only sound was the frantic, panic thumping of his own heart against his ribs. Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. At the entrance of the alley, a figure stood silhouetted against the weak light of the street. It was tall and unnaturally lean, a collection of sharp angles and ragged edges. As it took a step forward, into the flickering cone of light from the caged bulb, the details began to resolve themselves, and Izuku's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He wore a bizarre, makeshift collection of dark gear, held together by belts and straps. But it was the weapons that seized Izuku's attention. They were everywhere, knives of varying lengths strapped to his thighs, his arms, his chest. A jagged, brutal-looking katana was slung across his back. His face was almost entirely obscured by a tattered, off-white scarf wrapped around his head like a mummy's bandages, leaving only his eyes and nose exposed. And his eyes, they were wide, unblinking, and shot through with blood-red veins. They burned with a terrifying, fanatical intensity. There was no sanity in them. Only conviction. Izuku knew who this was. He'd seen the police reports, the grainy news footage, the terrified eyewitness accounts. The man who hunted heroes. The man who left a trail of crippled professionals in his wake. The hero killer, Stain. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over him, so potent it was physically nauseating. His breath hitched. His limbs refused to move. He was paralyzed, a mouse frozen in the gaze of a viper. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to scream, to do something, but his body was a statue of fear. He was going to die, here, in this filthy alley, after having his dreams crushed by his greatest hero. He was going to be murdered by a monster. The sheer, tragic irony of it was almost enough to make him laugh, a hysterical, bubbling sound that died in his throat as a choked gasp. Stain took another slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of his boots on the grimy concrete was like a drumbeat counting down the final seconds of Izuku's life. He stopped about 10 feet away, his head tilted slightly, studying Izuku with that same unnerving, predatory focus. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the flash of a blade, for the searing pain. "I'm sorry, Mom." The thought was a desperate, silent prayer, but the killing blow didn't come. Instead, a voice cut through the silence. It was a low, raspy sound, like stones grinding together. "You reek of it," the hero killer said. Izuku's eyes snapped open. What? The stench of false idols," Stain clarified, his voice dripping with contempt. "The cloying perfume of manufactured hope. It clings to you. I saw you with him." All Might. Izuku couldn't breathe. He knew. He'd seen them, I saw it all, Stain continued, as if reading his mind. He gestured vaguely with a bandaged hand towards the street. The farce in the marketplace, a third-rate villain, a collection of incompetent, fame-hungry peacocks in costumes, and a populace of mindless sheep, recording it all on their phones. A perfect microcosm of this diseased society. He took another step. Izuku flinched, pressing himself so hard against the wall he could feel the rough texture of every individual brick. Those heroes, they did nothing. They stood by, making excuses, preening for the cameras, while a child was being suffocated. They are a disease. A plague of hypocrisy that has infected the very word hero. His voice grew louder, laced with a zealot's righteous fury. They are not heroes. They are entertainers. They are glorified civil servants chasing a paycheck and a popularity poll. They have twisted a noble calling into a vulgar profession. Stain's burning gaze fixed on Izuku, and the intensity was like a physical blow. And then, there was you. Izuku trembled. He didn't understand. This was a monster. A killer. Why was he talking to him? Why wasn't he dead yet? No quirk, Stain stated. It wasn't a question. No power. No training. Your legs were shaking. Fear was pouring off you in waves. By every metric of this broken world, you were the most useless person there. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. And yet, you were the only one who moved. You were the only hero on that street today. Izuku's mind screeched to a halt. The words were so fundamentally at odds with everything he had just experienced, with everything he had ever been told, that he couldn't process them. The only hero? He'd been a reckless fool. He'd gotten in the way. He hadn't saved anyone. Do not mistake me, Stain rasped, his eyes narrowing. Your actions were tactically idiotic. You were an obstacle. But your spirit, your intent, that was pure. An instinct untainted by pride or greed. You saw someone in need of saving, and you acted. That is the definition of heroism. A definition this world has forgotten. He slowly paced back and forth, his ragged coat swirling around his ankles. I followed you. I heard the exchange on the rooftop. I heard the symbol of peace, the great All Might, feed you the same poison the rest of them do. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. He told you that you cannot be a hero. Izuku choked back a sob. Hearing the words spoken by this terrifying figure made them real in a new, horrifying way. Stain stopped pacing and stood directly in front of him. He loomed over Izuku, a specter of violence and conviction. He looked down at the boy, curled up and broken at the bottom of a filthy wall. He is right, Stain said, and Izuku's last, infinitesimal speck of hope dissolved. Of course. This was it. The final twist of the knife before the end. And he is wrong, Stain continued, his voice shifting. The burning rage was still there, but it was now underpinned by something else. Something that sounded, terrifyingly, like purpose. You cannot be their kind of hero, Stain clarified, spitting the word there like a curse. You cannot be a smiling fraud on a lunchbox. You cannot be a preening celebrity who values their public image over a human life. You cannot join their ranks, because their ranks are corrupt to the very core. To become one of them would be to kill the very thing that makes you worthy. He crouched down, bringing his terrifying, bloodshot eyes level with Izuku's. The proximity was suffocating. Izuku could smell the faint, coppery scent of old blood on his clothes. They told you that your dream is impossible. They offered you only despair. They look at you and see a quirkless, useless child. Stain's lips curled into something that might have been a sneer or a smile. It was impossible to tell. I look at you, and I see a foundation. A vessel of pure, untainted conviction, free from the arrogance of power. A blank slate upon which the definition of a true hero can be written. He held Izuku's gaze, and for the first time, Izuku saw past the madness. He saw a core of absolute, unshakable belief. This man, this killer, believed every single word he was saying with the entirety of his being. This world doesn't need more heroes who can punch hard. It is choking on them. It needs a purge. It needs a symbol of what heroism should be. It needs someone to remind them that heroism is not about power. It is about sacrifice. It is about will. It is about the conviction to do what is necessary. The hero killer, Stain, fell silent. The alley was quiet again, save for the frantic pounding in Izuku's ears and the distant, mournful wail of a siren. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kaizomi Akaguro extended a hand. It was a calloused, scarred hand, wrapped in dirty bandages. It was not a hand offered in friendship or comfort. It was a hand offered as a tool, as a weapon. A hand stained with the blood of those he deemed unworthy, now offering to forge a new path through blood and shadow. Your path to their fraudulent light has been closed, he said, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble. So I will offer you a different one. A path through the dark. I will teach you. I will train you. I will strip away your weakness and forge your spirit into steel. I will show you how to bring true justice to this sick, sad world. He held his hand steady in the space between them, an invitation hanging in the foul air. I can show you how to be a real hero. Izuku stared at the outstretched hand. His mind was a maelstrom of terror, confusion, and a terrifying, seductive flicker of something he had thought was dead, hope. His idol, the symbol of peace, had left him in a gutter of despair. The monster, the hero killer, was offering to pull him out. The choice was impossible. It was madness. But as he looked from the bloody, offered hand to the fanatical, believing eyes of the man before him, Izuku Midoriya, the boy who was told he could not be a hero, had to ask himself a terrible question. What else did he have left? Izuku's hand trembled in the space between them. It was a fragile, unscarred thing, the hand of a student, accustomed to holding a pen, not a weapon. Before him, Stain's hand waited, calloused, wrapped in grimy bandages, a promise of violence and a rejection of everything Izuku had ever known. To take it was to step off a cliff into an abyss from which there could be no return. His mind was a screaming cacophony of fear and doubt. This was insane. This was a villain, a murderer, the antithesis of the heroic ideal. His mother's worried face flashed in his mind's eye, a beacon of warmth and love in the encroaching darkness. He should run. He should scream for help. He should do anything but this. But where would he run to? Back to a world that had labeled him worthless? Back to the pitying stares and the casual cruelty? Back to the crushing, absolute certainty that his life's singular dream was a childish fantasy? All Might's words echoed again, not as a memory, but as a fresh, deep wound. No. You can't be a hero. The world of light had slammed its door in his face and left him in the dark. And here, in that very darkness, was a hand reaching out for him. With a shuddering breath that felt like his last as Izuku Midoriya, the hopeful fanboy, he reached out and took it. Stain's grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. There was no warmth in the touch, no comfort. There was only the grim finality of a contract being sealed. Good, Stain rasped, his voice devoid of praise. It was a simple statement of fact. He rose to his full, intimidating height, pulling Izuku to his feet with effortless strength. The weak cling to false hope, the strong forge their own. We have work to do. He turned and began to walk out of the alley, not once looking back to see if Izuku was following. The assumption was absolute. Izuku had made his choice. Obedience was now a given. Numbly, his legs moving as if disconnected from his own will, Izuku followed. He cast one last glance back at the filthy wall where he had hit rock bottom, then turned his face towards the monster leading him into the night. He felt like Orpheus, descending into the underworld, already knowing he could never look back. Their journey through the sleeping city was a silent, spectral thing. Stain moved with an unnatural grace, a wraith flowing through the urban landscape. He didn't stick to the sidewalks but led Izuku through a labyrinth of back alleys, service corridors, and forgotten underpasses. It was the city's circulatory system, the grimy veins hidden beneath the glittering skin of society. Twice they heard the distant thud of a hero's patrol, and Stain would melt into a recessed doorway or a patch of deep shadow, pulling Izuku with him. He moved as if he were a natural part of the city's gloom, utterly invisible to those who lived in the light. Their destination was a condemned tenement building in a forgotten ward of the city, a skeletal structure hunched between a rusted-out warehouse and a defunct power substation. The windows were boarded up, the brickwork crumbling. A faded sign above the door read, "Museum for Municipal Housing Unit C." It looked like a place where hope had come to die long ago. Stain slipped through a gap in the barricaded entrance with the ease of a snake. The air inside was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust, decay, and something metallic and sharp, like old blood and whetstones. Stain produced a small, powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a star cone through the oppressive darkness, illuminating a constellation of dust motes. He led Izuku up 3 flights of creaking stairs to a small, one-room apartment at the end of a corridor. This was his lair. His home. It was a testament to a life of brutal, single-minded purpose. There was a thin, stained mattress on the floor in one corner, a threadbare blanket folded neatly upon it. In another corner was a small, grimy kitchenette with a single hot plate and a mini-fridge that hummed erratically. The main space was dominated by a large, scarred wooden table. Upon it, laid out with surgical precision, were the tools of his trade, knives of every conceivable shape and size, whetstones, bottles of oil, cleaning rags, and spools of medical gauze. The walls were bare concrete, save for one. This wall was covered in a vast, sprawling map of the city, crisscrossed with lines of red and black yarn. Dozens of photographs were pinned to it, the smiling, professional headshots of pro heroes. Many of them had a thick, black X drawn through their faces. Others had notes scrawled beside them in a jagged, aggressive script. Vanity. Greed. Cowardice. It was a hit list. A declaration of war. This was no longer a nightmare Izuku could wake up from. This was his new reality. "There is one thing you must do before we begin," Stain said, his back to Izuku as he began methodically unstrapping the weapons from his body. "Sever your ties. A warrior cannot be shackled by sentiment. Your old life is a liability." The words struck Izuku with the force of a physical blow. His mother. The image of her smile, her constant encouragement, her tearful apologies for his quirkless diagnosis. She was the one anchor he had left in the world. And he had to cut the rope. She'll worry," Izuku stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Worry is a luxury for a world we are trying to burn away." Stain countered, not unkindly, but with an utter lack of sympathy. "But a missing persons report will draw unwanted attention. You will write a note. Tell her you have been accepted into a specialist hero training program. One that is intensive and requires you to live on site. No contact allowed. A believable lie for a boy as obsessed as you." It was a cruelly elegant solution. A lie that would comfort his mother while twisting the knife in Izuku's own heart. He was getting his dream, in a way. A dark, perverse reflection of it. Stain produced a cheap notebook and a pen from a drawer and set them on the table. Izuku stared at the blank page, his throat tight. How could he do this? How could he write the most painful lie of his life? Each word would be a betrayal, but the alternative was unthinkable. He couldn't go back. He had no future there. Here there was something. A purpose. A terrible, bloody purpose, but a purpose nonetheless. His hand shook as he began to write. "Mom, something amazing has happened. I know I've been down lately, but I got an offer. It's from a private, very exclusive training academy for late bloomers and specialists. It's an accelerated hero course. They saw my analysis notebooks and said I have potential, that they can teach me how to be a hero even without a quirk." A tear fell, splattering on the paper, making the ink run. He wiped his cheek angrily. Crying was a weakness. "The thing is, it's a full immersion program. It's very secretive. I have to go right away, and I'll be living at their facility. We're not allowed any outside contact until we graduate, to ensure total focus. It's going to be really, really hard, but it's my chance. It's everything I've ever wanted. Please don't worry about me. And please don't try to find me or contact the school. It's part of the test. Trust me. I'm going to make you so proud. I love you, Izuku." He folded the note, his fingers feeling numb and clumsy. It felt like a suicide note for the person he used to be. Under Stain's watchful eye, he slipped out of the building and ran the few blocks to his apartment. He left the note on the kitchen table, where she would be sure to find it in the morning. He took one last, lingering look at the familiar, warm space, the All Might posters on his wall now a bitter irony, and slipped back out into the night, a ghost leaving his own life behind. When he returned to the hideout, the last of his boyish softness had been scraped away. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. He was hollowed out, empty. Stain gave a single, sharp nod. Good. Now you are a blank slate. Now we can begin. The training was not training. It was a crucible. It was a systematic process of breaking down Izuku's body, mind, and spirit, and reforging them into something else. There were no encouraging words, no pats on the back, no acknowledgement of progress. There was only the task, the pain, and Stain's unwavering, critical gaze. The mornings began before dawn. The first lesson was pain. Your body is a tool, Stain declared on that first brutal morning, his voice echoing in the cavernous, empty warehouse they used as a training ground. Right now, it is a dull, brittle instrument. We will sharpen it. We will temper it. He ordered Izuku into a push-up position. Begin. Izuku did them, his form sloppy at first, then corrected by a sharp kick to his ribs from Stain's boot. He pushed through 10, 20, 30. His arms began to tremble, burning with lactic acid. At 50, they gave out, and he collapsed onto the filthy concrete floor, panting. I did not say stop. Stain's voice was flat. I can't. Izuku gasped, his muscles screaming in protest. Stain loomed over him. Pain is a signal. Nothing more. It tells you where your limits are. True strength is found by ignoring that signal and pushing beyond the limit. Get up, Izuku tried, but his arms wouldn't obey. A cold dread washed over him as Stain knelt, grabbing a fistful of his hair and yanking his head up. Pain is a teacher, he hissed, his face inches from Izuku's, and you will learn to listen to it. Again, that first day, Izuku was pushed until he threw up from exertion. Then he was made to run until his legs buckled beneath him. He was forced to hold stressed positions until his entire body was a single, vibrating knot of agony. He learned that his limits were not walls, but flimsy curtains his mind had erected, and Stain was there to tear every single one of them down. After the body, came the environment. Stain took him to the rooftops. A hero limited to the ground is a caged animal, he said, standing on the ledge of a 5-story building. The wind whipped at them, a mournful howl that seemed to pull at Izuku's feet. Across a 10-foot gap was the roof of the adjacent building. The city is not a series of streets. It is a 3-dimensional battle space. You will learn its geography. You will learn to move through it like a whisper. Cross. Izuku stared at the gap. It was a chasm. The street below was a dizzying, fatal drop. I'll fall, probably, Stain agreed calmly. And if you are not fast enough to grab the ledge as you do, you will die. A worthy hero would not hesitate. An unworthy one would fall. The choice is yours. Fear was a cold, paralyzing weight in his gut. But the memory of Stain's other lessons, the lessons on pain, surfaced. Fear was just another signal. He backed up, took a running start, his heart hammering against his ribs, and leaped. For a terrifying second, he was suspended in the air, the city lights a blur beneath him. His feet hit the far ledge, scrabbling for purchase. His fingers clawed at the gravelly surface of the roof. He managed to haul his trembling body onto solid ground, his breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. He had done it. He looked up, expecting something. A nod of approval? A flicker of acknowledgement? The jump was clumsy, Stain said, having crossed the gap in a silent, fluid motion that was more like flight than a leap. Your landing was loud. You wasted energy. Again, for weeks, the rooftops were his school. He learned to run, to jump, to balance on narrow ledges, to fall and catch himself. He learned to read the architecture of the city, to see handholds where others saw decorative brickwork, to see pathways where others saw impassable walls. His body, already lean, was stripped of any remaining baby fat and coated with dense, functional muscle. Scars began to map his journey across his hands and shins, a cartography of failure and perseverance. The physical conditioning was only half of the ordeal. The other half was the indoctrination. Every evening, after a meager meal of protein paste and water, came the ideological lesson. They would sit in the dim light of the hideout, a small, crackling television in front of them, tuned to the evening news. For Izuku, this had once been a ritual of adoration. Now, it was a vivisection. Watch! Stain would command, as the news showed a popular hero, Captain Celebrity, striking a pose for the cameras after stopping a bank robbery. Debris from the bank's facade littered the street. See how he smiles for them? Stain's voice was a low growl. He shattered the front of that building. A clean, quiet apprehension was possible, but it would not have been spectacular. He chose the path that would get his face on the evening news, heedless of the cost, the danger from the falling debris, the cleanup. He is not a hero. He is an actor, and that was his performance. Izuku, in the first few weeks, would try to argue. But he stopped the robbers. He saved the hostages. Saving lives is the bare minimum. It is the pretense for their fame. Stain would counter, his eyes burning. The question is not if they save them, but how. With what motive? With what consideration? A true hero is a selfless servant. That man is a brand. He serves himself. Night after night, the lesson was hammered home. They watched heroes endorse products. They watched them prioritize interviews over securing a scene. They watched them hesitate, waiting for a more powerful hero to arrive rather than taking a necessary risk. Stain would dissect their every action, every word, peeling back the layers of heroic pageantry to reveal what he saw as the rotten core of vanity and greed beneath. Slowly, insidiously, it began to work. Izuku, with his analytical mind, started to see the pattern Stain pointed out. He saw the unnecessary property damage. He saw the moments of hesitation. He began to see the cracks in the golden idols he had worshipped his entire life. The world was no longer black and white, heroes and villains. It was a murky, cynical gray. The final stage of his transformation involved the one part of his old life he had managed to bring with him, his notebooks. One day, Stain found them tucked under Izuku's mattress. Izuku tensed, expecting the hero-killer to destroy them as relics of his pathetic, fanboy past. Stain leafed through a charred volume, his expression unreadable. He saw the detailed drawings, the meticulous notes on quirk usage, support gear, and fighting styles. He closed the book and looked at Izuku. "You were not just a fan," he stated. "You were a threat analyst." The word stunned Izuku. He had never thought of it that way. "This admiration is a weakness," Stain said, tapping the singed cover of Volume 13. "It clouds your judgment. You catalogued their strengths because you wished to emulate them. You ignored their weaknesses because you could not bear to see flaws in your idols." He tossed the notebook onto the table. "That ends now. Your analysis will continue. But your purpose is no longer to admire. It is to deconstruct. It is to dismantle. You will look at these heroes not as a fan, but as an opponent. You will find their flaws, their blind spots, their dependencies, their psychological triggers. You will turn these books of worship into manuals of execution. This is your weapon. Learn to wield it." It was the most difficult task of all. It felt like a profound betrayal of his younger self. He opened the new notebook, the first blank page staring up at him like an accusation. He chose a hero he'd always admired, the wood-based hero, Kamui Woods. He started, as he always did, by listing his strengths. Quirk Arbor. Excellent for large-scale capture and mobility in dense urban environments. Signature move, lacquered chain prison, highly effective for non-lethal restraint. Then, he forced himself to switch perspectives. He had to look at Kamui Woods through Stain's eyes. Weaknesses, he wrote, the word feeling alien and wrong. Highly susceptible to fire-based attacks. Mobility is severely limited in open areas with no anchor points. Over-reliance on his signature move creates predictable patterns of attack. A fast opponent could close the distance while his limbs are extended. Psychological profile suggests a degree of vanity and a desire for dramatic, clean captures, likely to hesitate if a situation is too messy or risk civilian casualties in a way that would reflect badly on him. He stared at the words. It was cold, clinical, brutal, and it was all true. He felt a wave of self-loathing, but beneath it, there was a spark of something else. A grim, terrifying sense of power. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was seeing the game board in its entirety for the first time. Months bled into one another, marked only by the phases of the moon and the growing collection of scars on Izuku's body. He grew taller, his frame hardening into wiry strength. His face lost its round, boyish softness, becoming sharper, more angular. But the most significant change was in his eyes. The wide, earnest, and often tearful eyes of Izuku Midoriya were gone. In their place was a gaze that was unnervingly calm, analytical, and cold. It was the gaze of someone who had been to hell and had memorized the layout. One evening, he was practicing alone in the hideout. He held a blunt training knife, a mirror of one of Stain's own. He moved through a silent kata his mentor had drilled into him, a fluid and deadly dance of feints, slashes, and evasions. His movements were no longer clumsy or hesitant. They were economical, precise, each one with a purpose. He was no longer reacting, he was anticipating. He finished the sequence, his body slick with sweat, his breath steady. He held the dull blade up, and for a moment, he caught his own reflection in the polished steel. The face that stared back was a stranger's. The freckles were still there, a faint echo of the child he had been. But the eyes, they belonged to someone else. They were the eyes of a hunter, the eyes of someone who knew the world was a dark and brutal place, and that the only way to survive it, the only way to change it, was to be darker and more brutal than anything else in it. He lowered the blade and walked to the table. He picked up his latest notebook. Hero Analysis for the Culling, Volume 1. It was filled with his new, colder analysis. It detailed patrol routes, gear vulnerabilities, and psychological weaknesses of dozens of heroes operating in the city. It was no longer a love letter to heroism. It was a weapon, loaded and ready. He had been through the fire, and he had not broken. He had been forged. And as he closed the notebook, a quiet, chilling thought surfaced in his mind, a thought that would have horrified him just a few short months ago. I'm ready. The 6 months Izuku had spent in Stain's shadow had been a lifetime. He had been unmade and remade in a crucible of pain, fear, and relentless ideological pressure. The soft, hesitant boy who had cried in an alley was a ghost, a shed skin left behind in the dirt. In his place stood a lean, hardened youth who moved with a predator's economy of motion, whose eyes no longer held stars of admiration but the cold, calculating light of a threat analyst. He thought he understood the path he was on. He had accepted its darkness, its violence, its isolation. He had learned the brutal catechism of Stain's philosophy by heart, but understanding a philosophy in the sterile environment of a hideout, and applying it in the wet, breathing chaos of the real world were two entirely different things. He was about to learn that the step from theory to practice was a step across a bloody chasm. It began on a rain-slicked evening. The hideout was stuffy, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and the metallic tang of oiled steel. Stain was meticulously sharpening his katana, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of the whetstone against the blade a familiar, unsettling metronome for their life in the shadows. Izuku was finishing his own nightly ritual, stretching his aching muscles, feeling the pull and burn of tissues that had been torn and rebuilt 100 times over. Tonight, Stain said without looking up from his work, your observation ends. Your education begins. Izuku froze mid-stretch, his heart giving a single, hard thump against his ribs. He had been on dozens of observation runs, shadowing Stain from the rooftops as the hero-killer gathered intelligence on his targets. He had watched, analyzed, and recorded, but he had always been a spectator. The word education implied participation. We have a target, Stain continued, his voice a low rasp. He finally looked up, his bloodshot eyes pinning Izuku in place. This is a test. You will observe my methods up close. You will see how the cull is performed. You will see the conviction required to excise the rot from this society. And you will not interfere. Your only role is to watch, to learn, and to control the fear that will inevitably try to consume you. Is that understood? Yes, Izuku said, his voice steadier than he felt. His throat was dry. Good. Stain stood, sheathing his blade with a soft, final click. He walked over to the sprawling map on the wall, the web of yarn and photos that served as his Bible of righteous fury. He tapped a photo near the periphery of the city. The picture was of a man in his late 20s with spiky, ash-blonde hair and a perpetual smirk. His hero costume was garish, a mix of flame-retardant blacks and oranges, with oversized gauntlets designed to channel his quirk. Pro Hero Backdraft. Real name Kenji Tsubaki. Quirk, Plasma Burst. He can generate and expel small, volatile spheres of superheated plasma from his palms. Izuku knew of him. Backdraft was a C-lister, mostly active in the industrial wards. His public approval rating was mediocre. He was known for being effective against low-level thugs but also for leaving a significant amount of property damage in his wake. A perfect specimen of the disease, Stain sneered, his lip curling in disgust. He has no ambition to be great. He has no desire to be a symbol. He is a parasite, content to feed on the scraps of the system. My sources confirm he is on the payroll of a demolition and reconstruction company. He stages his fights with petty criminals, using his quirk with deliberate recklessness to maximize structural damage. He ensures his friends get the contract for the cleanup and rebuilding, and for his service, he receives a generous kickback. Stain turned back to Izuku, his gaze burning with intensity. He is the definition of a fake. He endangers the public for profit. He wears the title of hero as a costume to enrich himself. He is a cancer, and tonight we are the surgeons. We will find him on his patrol. We will follow him. And when the moment is right, you will watch as I deliver judgment. Izuku's analysis of Backdraft had been sitting in his notebook for weeks. He'd flagged the hero as a potential Stain target himself. Primary weakness, overconfidence. Relies on ranged quirk attacks, leaving him vulnerable to close-quarters combat. Poor defensive skills. His gauntlets are a critical component. If they are damaged or disabled, his control over the plasma becomes erratic and dangerous to himself. Psychologically, he is motivated by greed, not duty, and will likely avoid any confrontation that does not offer a clear financial or reputational reward. He had written the words with cold detachment. Now those words were coalescing into a real person, a man who was going to be ambushed, crippled, and left bleeding in an alley. The clinical nature of his analysis felt like a flimsy shield against the gruesome reality rushing towards him. Get your gear, Stain commanded. Stay in the shadows. Make no sound. Do not be seen. And do not, under any circumstances, intervene. The rain fell in a steady, miserable drizzle, turning the city into a glistening slick of neon and shadow. Izuku moved like a phantom 3 stories above the street, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the wet gravel of the rooftops. Every lesson Stain had beaten into him was now at the forefront of his mind. Use the cover of air conditioning units, stay low, watch your silhouette against the skyline, listen. He and Stain were perched on the edge of a warehouse, overlooking a desolate street in the industrial sector. The air smelled of rain, rust, and the chemical tang from a nearby factory. Below, Backdraft was on his pathetic excuse for a patrol. He wasn't scanning the rooftops or checking the alleys. He was sauntering down the middle of the street, illuminated by the streetlights, one hand on his hip, the other scrolling through his phone. He was a caricature of a hero, a man performing for an audience that wasn't there. Arrogant, Stain whispered from the darkness beside Izuku. The word was a puff of white vapor in the cold air. He feels safe. He believes his title protects him. It is a fatal miscalculation. They shadowed him for nearly an hour. Izuku's initial anxiety began to sharpen into a focused, analytical calm. He noted Backdraft's sloppy patrol route, the way he ignored the darker, more dangerous side streets, the way his attention was consistently divided. The man was a walking vulnerability. Then it happened. Just as Stain's intelligence had predicted, 2 figures emerged from a side alley, brandishing crowbars. They were small-time thugs, their posturing more theatrical than threatening. They shouted generic threats at Backdraft, demanding his wallet. Backdraft sighed, an exaggerated, put-upon sound that carried up to the rooftops. He dramatically put his phone away. Really, guys? You know who I am? You're making a big mistake. Izuku's eyes narrowed. This was it. The stage was set. Just watch the boy, Stain murmured, his voice a low vibration. Watch how he uses his power. Not to apprehend, but to destroy. The fight was a joke. The thugs swung their crowbars with clumsy, telegraphed motions. Backdraft dodged with lazy ease, a smirk on his face. He could have ended it in seconds, a simple leg sweep, a concussive blast near their feet. Instead, he started showing off. He shot a small burst of plasma that exploded against the brick wall of a pawn shop, sending a shower of shattered brick and mortar across the sidewalk. "Whoops! Slippery fingers!" he called out with a mock apology. The thugs scrambled back. He fired another. This one impacted a metal dumpster, blasting the lid off its hinges and sending it spinning into the street with a deafening clang. Izuku felt a knot of disgust tighten in his stomach. Stain was right. This wasn't a hero stopping a crime. This was a demolition man doing his job. He was deliberately aiming at property, not the criminals. The two thugs, clearly realizing they were outmatched and that this was more than they'd signed up for, turned to flee back down the alley they'd come from. "Oh no, you don't! You're not getting away before the reporters show up!" Backdraft yelled. He raised his gauntlet, a larger, more volatile sphere of orange plasma crackling to life in his palm, and that's when Izuku saw her, an old woman. She had been inside the pawn shop, a small, stooped figure Izuku hadn't even noticed. The first plasma blast must have terrified her, because the door to the shop creaked open and she peered out, her face a mask of wrinkled fear. She was probably the owner, checking on the damage. She stood directly in the line of fire between Backdraft and the fleeing thugs. Izuku's blood ran cold. He sees her. He has to see her, but Backdraft's eyes were locked on his targets. Or maybe he did see her and simply didn't care. His ego, his desire for a spectacular finish, had blinded him to everything else. He was about to fire a blast powerful enough to blow a hole in a concrete wall, and an innocent old woman was standing right in its path. "Do not intervene." Stain's order was an iron cage around Izuku's mind. This was a test of his discipline. He was supposed to watch. To learn. But what was the lesson? To stand by while an innocent was harmed by a fraudulent hero? Wasn't the entire point of Stain's ideology to protect the worthy from the unworthy? His philosophy and his direct order were now in violent, direct contradiction. In his mind's eye, Izuku saw the sludge villain incident. He saw the pro-heroes standing by useless. He saw Kaken suffocating. He remembered the feeling of his own legs moving before he'd even made a conscious choice. That same, primal, heroic instinct surged through him now, a roaring fire that incinerated Stain's command. He couldn't watch. He wouldn't. Backdraft's arm tensed. The plasma ball swelled, sizzling in the rain. Izuku moved. He didn't think. He analyzed. In a split second, his mind processed the scene not as a hero, but as the predator Stain had trained him to be. Distance to target, 30 meters. Drop 3 stories. Backdraft's attention is focused forward. Wind is negligible. Environment, wet, multiple obstacles. Available weapon. His eyes landed on a length of rusted rebar lying amidst the rooftop debris. It was heavy. Too slow. Then he saw it. A 2-foot section of metal conduit pipe, probably ripped from the wall by a storm. It was light enough to throw, heavy enough to matter. He grabbed the pipe. Backdraft was drawing his arm back for the shot. The old woman was frozen in terror. There was no time to get down to the street. There was no time for a warning. Izuku did the only thing he could. With a choked cry, he hurled the pipe with all the desperate, conditioned strength in his body. He didn't aim for Backdraft's head. A killing blow was not the goal. He aimed for the weapon. The gauntlet. The pipe flew true, a dark streak through the rain-soaked air. It struck Backdraft's raised forearm with a sickening thwack of metal on metal. The hero cried out in pain and surprise. The plasma sphere, its release disrupted, didn't shoot forward. It detonated in his hand. The explosion was contained by the gauntlet, but not entirely. It blew backwards, engulfing his arm in a flash of searing orange light and sending him stumbling back, screaming. His shot was ruined. The thugs vanished into the alley. The old woman, startled by the flash, scrambled back inside her shop, safe. From the rooftop, Izuku panted, his body thrumming with adrenaline. He had done it. He had saved her. And he had disobeyed a direct order from the hero killer, Stain. A heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder, the grip like a vice. "You foolish boy!" Stain's voice was a low, guttural snarl right next to his ear. It was not the voice of a mentor. It was the voice of a judge. I gave you one command. Down below, Backdraft was clutching his arm, his gauntlets sparking and smoking. He looked up, his face contorted with rage and pain, scanning the rooftops. Who's up there? Show yourself, you coward! Before Izuku could react, Stain acted. He shoved Izuku forward off the ledge. Your lesson is not over, he hissed. You have interfered. Now you will finish it. Izuku fell. Panic flared in his chest, hot and sharp. But his training took over. He twisted in the air, his eyes scanning for a handhold, an escape route, anything. He hit the rusted metal of a fire escape with a bone-jarring impact, his fingers instinctively clamping around a railing. He grunted in pain but held on, his descent arrested. He quickly dropped the remaining 10 feet, landing in a crouch in the mouth of a side alley, hidden from Backdraft's immediate line of sight. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He had been so focused on the immediate threat that he hadn't planned a single second past throwing the pipe. Now he was on the ground, his only weapon gone, facing a wounded and enraged pro-hero. There you are! Backdraft snarled, spotting him. He stalked towards the alley, his left arm hanging uselessly, the gauntlet a mangled, smoking wreck. His right arm, however, was fine. A new, smaller ball of plasma ignited in his good hand. You're going to pay for that, you little vigilante punk! Izuku backed away into the alley. His mind was racing, cataloging his surroundings. Wet pavement. A overflowing dumpster. A loose manhole cover. A stack of discarded wooden pallets. His training screamed at him. The environment is your weapon. Backdraft entered the alley, blocking the only exit. He was overconfident, even now. He saw a skinny kid in dark clothes, a nobody. He didn't see a threat. Just hold still, the hero sneered. This will only hurt until you pass out. He lunged, swiping with his plasma-wreathed hand. Izuku dodged, the heat of the plasma scorching his cheek. He was faster, more agile. Months of rooftop parkour had made him light on his feet. He ducked under another swipe and kicked out, not at Backdraft's torso, but at his knee. A disabling, non-lethal target. The kick connected, and Backdraft grunted, his leg buckling slightly. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was precise and unexpected. The hero was a brawler, used to trading heavy blows. He wasn't prepared for this kind of tactical, targeted assault. You little rat! He roared, firing a wild plasma burst. Izuku dove behind the dumpster. The plasma ball impacted the metal container, and the alley was filled with the deafening boom and the stench of burnt garbage and ozone. The heat washed over him. Shrapnel from the dumpster peppered the wall behind him. He's not trying to capture me, Izuku realized with a jolt of terror. He's trying to kill me. This hero was willing to use lethal force on an unknown assailant in a dark alley without a moment's hesitation. Stain's words about the rot in society echoed in his head, now backed by the very real threat of imminent incineration. He needed a weapon. He needed an equalizer. His eyes darted around and found it. Leaning against the dumpster was a length of heavy, rust-pitted pipe. A real weapon this time. He grabbed it, the cold, rough metal a grim comfort in his hands. He waited, listening. He could hear Backdraft's heavy breathing, the crackle of the plasma in his hand. He was coming around the dumpster. Use his arrogance against him. Just as Backdraft rounded the corner, Izuku exploded upwards from his crouch. He didn't swing for the head. He swung low, putting all his weight behind the blow, aiming for the hero's remaining gauntlet. The pipe connected with a brutal crunch of metal and bone. Backdraft screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony as his wrist shattered. The plasma in his hand fizzled out. Both his primary weapons were now disabled. But the hero was tough. Fueled by pain and rage, he lunged forward, tackling Izuku and driving him hard against the brick wall. The pipe clattered to the ground. The air was driven from Izuku's lungs in a pained gasp. Backdraft's face was inches from his, contorted in a mask of pure hate. I'll kill you with my bare hands! He bellowed, his breath hot and foul. He drew back a fist. But Izuku had been through Stain's pain conditioning. He had learned to think through the agony. As Backdraft's fist flew towards his face, Izuku twisted, taking the blow on his shoulder instead of his jaw. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the alley, and a bolt of white-hot fire shot down his arm. a broken collarbone. The pain was nauseating, overwhelming, but he was still conscious. He still had one good arm. He brought his knee up sharply, driving it into Backdraft's unprotected groin. The hero choked, his eyes bulging. His attack faltered, and he doubled over with a wheezing groan. It was the only opening Izuku would get. Ignoring the fire in his shoulder, he scrambled for the pipe. He got his hand on it, and swung it upwards in a desperate, clumsy arc, striking Backdraft hard in the side of the head. The hero crumpled, falling to the wet pavement with a heavy, final thud. He was unconscious. Not dead. But broken. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the steady drumming of the rain and Izuku's own ragged, agonized breathing. He stood over the fallen hero, his chest heaving, his left arm hanging uselessly. The pipe felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He had done it. He had won. It didn't feel like a victory. He felt sick. A slow, deliberate clapping sound started from the mouth of the alley. Izuku's head snapped up, his body tensing for another fight. Stain stood there, a dark silhouette against the streetlights, his arms crossed. He had been there the whole time. Watching. Disobedient. Stain said, his voice a low, chillingly calm rumble. Impulsive. Emotional. He walked forward, his boots splashing in the puddles, until he stood over the unconscious form of Backdraft. He nudged the man with his foot, a gesture of ultimate contempt. And yet, effective. He looked at Izuku, his burning gaze sweeping over him, taking in his trembling form, his useless arm, the blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. You disobeyed my order, Stain stated, the fury back in his voice. For that, there should be a severe punishment. Izuku braced himself, his knuckles wide on the pipe. However, Stain continued, his tone shifting. You did not act out of fear or weakness. You acted to protect an innocent from a fake. You upheld the core tenet of my ideology, even in defiance of my direct command. You showed true conviction. He knelt beside Backdraft, unsheathing a wicked-looking combat knife. You have learned the lesson, even if you rejected the teacher. A hero's purpose is to save. This man was no hero. Therefore, he deserved no protection. Stain expertly, brutally, severed the tendons in Backdraft's shoulders and knees. The unconscious hero didn't even stir. It was done with a surgeon's precision and a butcher's finality. He will never wear a costume again, Stain declared, wiping his blade on Backdraft's uniform. He will serve as a message to the other fakes. A warning. Izuku watched, horrified and fascinated. He felt the bile rise in his throat. This was the reality of Stain's justice. Not just defeat, but utter, permanent ruin. Stain stood and faced him once more. You are injured. Your form was sloppy. Your victory was messy. But it was a victory nonetheless. You have tasted real combat. You have faced a hero and found him wanting. This is your true baptism. He pointed at Izuku's shoulder. That pain is your proof. That broken bone is your diploma. As they slipped away into the night, leaving the crippled hero to be found by the authorities, Izuku cradled his shattered shoulder. The physical pain was immense, a constant, grinding agony. But it was nothing compared to the turmoil in his soul. He had saved a life. And he had broken a man. He had acted like a hero, but his victory was delivered with a villain's brutality. Later, back in the hideout, as Stain roughly set his collarbone with a sickening crack and bandaged his wounds, Izuku caught his reflection in a shard of a broken mirror. His face was pale and bruised, his eyes wide and haunted. Along his cheek, where the heat of the plasma had scorched him, an angry red welt was beginning to form. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would scar. He touched the tender skin. It would be his first. A permanent mark on his skin to match the one that had just been seared into his soul. It was a reminder of the night he had crossed a line he could never uncross, the night he had learned the true, bloody cost of his new convictions. The line between hero and villain had never seemed so thin. The next 6 months were a blur of rain-lashed rooftops, rust-colored alleys, and the coppery tang of fear in the back of his throat. The scar on Izuku's cheek, a pale, jagged line where Backdraft's plasma had kissed his skin, served as a permanent reminder of his first brutal lesson. It was a brand, marking him as something other than the boy he'd been. His broken collarbone had healed into something stronger, a lattice of calcified bone that ached with the memory of its own breaking. Much like his spirit, the UA entrance exam came and went. On the day it was held, Izuku stood on a skyscraper miles away, watching the distant, glittering edifice of the Hero Academy through a pair of high-powered binoculars Stain had acquired. He watched the hopeful stream through the gates, teenagers his own age, brimming with confidence and vibrant quirks. He saw the explosive, unmistakable silhouette of Katsuki Bakugo swaggering through the crowd, radiating an aura of arrogant power. A bitter, hollow pang resonated in his chest, a phantom limb of a dream long since amputated. For a fleeting moment, he was Izuku Midoriya again, the quirkless Vanba who would have given anything to be among them. Stain's hand fell on his shoulder, the grip firm and grounding. "Do not mourn a poisoned chalice," the hero killer rasped, his voice a low growl beside Izuku's ear. "They flock to a temple of vanity. They seek fame and fortune, cloaked in the guise of heroism. Your classroom is the gutter. Your teachers are pain and necessity. You are receiving a truer education than any of them." Izuku lowered the binoculars, the hopeful expressions of the students blurring into a meaningless tableau. He pushed the ghost of his old self back down into the recesses of his mind and locked it away. Stain was right. That path was not for him. His was a different, darker road. He was no longer a candidate. He was the curriculum. He was no longer just Izuku. In the forge of the streets, he had been given a new name. Not by Stain, who called him only boy, but by the city itself. The name was a whisper passed between low-level thugs, a frustrated grumble in police precincts, a cautionary tale told by the corrupt and the cruel. They called him Kage, the Shadow. The name was born of his methods. He was a whisper in the dark, a flicker of motion at the edge of sight. He never announced his presence with a booming catchphrase. He never posed for a non-existent camera. His arrival was marked only by a sudden, terrifying silence, and his departure by the groaning, broken forms of his targets left for the authorities. His fighting style had evolved beyond Stain's rigid katas. It was a fluid, terrifyingly efficient synthesis of his mentor's brutal teachings and his own hyper-analytical mind. He was a creature of the environment. A thrown brick to create a diversion, a kick trash can to unbalance an opponent, the glint of a knife off a puddle to momentarily blind a foe. Every piece of urban detritus was a weapon in his hands. He moved with a parkour-honed grace that made him seem to defy gravity, using walls as springboards and fire escapes as ladders. Stain had taught him to kill. Izuku had refused to learn. This was the one, unshakable line he had drawn in the blood and grime of their new world. It was the last bastion of the boy who had charged the sludge villain. Sentiment. Stain would sneer after a mission where Izuku had left a target merely crippled. A fatal weakness. A true call removes the diseased element permanently. A hero saves people. Izuku would counter, his voice low but firm, his gaze unwavering. Even from themselves. Killing them makes me no better than a common murderer. Their arguments were fierce, ideological clashes in the gloom of their hideout. Stain saw Izuku's refusal to kill as a flaw in his creation, a persistent sentimentality he had failed to burn out of the boy. But he could not deny the results. Kage was becoming a force, a scalpel to Stain's sledgehammer. While Stain targeted the high-profile, fakes, to make grand, bloody statements, Kage worked at the roots. He dismantled street-level drug rings run by villains with minor quirks. He ambushed human traffickers in the city's derelict ports. He hunted the corrupt heroes who were too small-time for Stain's grand crusade but whose poison was just as potent. The heroes who took bribes to look the other way, who used excessive force on the powerless, who preyed on the citizens they were sworn to protect. He built a reputation. Villains started avoiding certain alleys after dark. Corrupt cops began to look over their shoulders on their patrols. Kage never killed, but his justice was terrifying. He didn't just defeat his opponents, he systematically dismantled them. He would break the hands of a villain whose quirk relied on touch. He would shatter the knees of a speedster. He would leave them alive, but their ability to harm others was permanently revoked. His methods were surgical, analytical, and utterly ruthless. His gear, cobbled together from stolen and salvaged parts, reflected his new identity. He wore dark, durable cargo pants tucked into reinforced combat boots. A tight, long-sleeved compression shirt of charcoal gray showed the lean, corded muscle of his new physique. Over it, he wore a custom-made tactical vest, bristling with pouches containing smoke pellets, caltrops, zip ties, and a compact first aid kit. His weapons were non-lethal but brutal: a pair of collapsible steel bow staffs, several blunted, weighted throwing knives designed for impact and disorientation, and a high-tensile wire garrote he used for restraining, never strangling. The most iconic piece of his costume was his mask. He had taken a reinforced paintball mask and modified it, painting it a flat, non-reflective black. It covered the lower half of his face, its filtered vents giving his breathing a quiet, artificial hiss. To complete the look, he wore a dark green, tattered hood, pulled low to cast his eyes in perpetual shadow. The only color on him was a subtle, almost invisible nod to his past. The metal plates on his gloves were painted a dark, crimson red, mimicking the color of All Might's smile. It was a private, bitter joke. The boy who had wanted to be a symbol of hope had become a symbol of fear. But he told himself, in the quiet, lonely hours before dawn, that he was using that fear to protect the very people the heroes had forgotten. It was a flimsy justification, a blanket he pulled over himself in the cold, but it was all he had. Detective Naomasa Tsukachi rubbed his tired eyes, the fluorescent lights of his office humming a monotonous, headache-inducing tune. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold, but he barely noticed. Spread across his desk was every scrap of information the Musudafa Police Department had on the city's newest and most infuriating enigma, the vigilante known as Kage. The file was thin, a frustrating collection of contradictions. "He's a ghost, Toshi," he said into his phone. On the other end, the quiet, wheezing breaths of Toshinori Yagi were the only response. All Might, in his skeletal form, was his oldest friend and most frequent consultant on cases that walked the line between law and chaos. "Tell me again, Naomasa." Toshinori's tired voice crackled through the speaker. Tsukachi leaned back in his chair, staring at the corkboard on his wall. It was covered in blurry CCTV stills, witness reports, and forensic analyses. First sighting was just over 6 months ago, a mugger found tied to a lamppost with his jaw dislocated. Since then, the incidents have escalated. We're averaging 2 or 3 a week now. The targets are a mix of known villains, usually low to mid-tier, and others. Others? That's the troubling part. Tsukachi sighed, picking up a report. Last month, Pro-Hero Mudslide was found unconscious in his patrol car. Both his arms were broken in 3 places. His quirk lets him manipulate earthy materials, but he needs complex hand gestures to do it. The attacker knew that. Mudslide won't be using his quirk again for a very long time, if ever. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Mudslide was under internal investigation for extortion, taking protection money from shopkeepers on his beat. The case was stalled for lack of evidence. The day after the attack, we received an anonymous data stick with encrypted files detailing every transaction he ever made. It was a closed case within 12 hours. So he's a vigilante with a knack for internal affairs. Toshinori mused, a grim humor in his tone. It's more than that, Tsukachi insisted. The MO is what's got us spooked. The brutality, the systematic crippling of his targets, the focus on corrupt heroes. It's reminiscent of the hero killer. A heavy silence hung on the line. Stain's name was a curse word in law enforcement circles. A boogeyman who had crippled or killed over a dozen pro-heroes. But he doesn't kill, Toshinori pointed out. That's a significant deviation. It's the only deviation. Tsukachi slammed a hand on his desk in frustration. The stealth, the tactical analysis, the sheer ruthlessness. It's like Stain's ghost is out there, but with a different code of ethics. Some of the analysts are calling him a copycat, a Stain adherent who's too squeamish to go all the way. But it doesn't feel like that. The precision is too great. This isn't hero worship, it's a methodology. He gestured at a blurry image on the board, a dark figure leaping between 2 buildings, caught by a traffic camera for a fraction of a second. And he's quirkless. Or at least, we think he is. That got Toshinori's full attention. What makes you say that? In every single incident, there has been 0 evidence of quirk usage. No energy signatures, no elemental residue, nothing. All the takedowns are accomplished through physical force, tactical use of the environment, and what appears to be an almost precognitive level of combat analysis. He takes his opponents apart, piece by piece, exploiting weaknesses they probably don't even know they have. The skill level is off the charts. It's a terrifying thought, a quirkless individual operating at this level. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Toshinori knew more than anyone what a quirkless individual, with the right training and spirit, could be capable of. The thought sent a chill down his spine, a cold tendril of a year-old regret. We have no face, no prints, no DNA. Sukachi continued his lament. He's a shadow. All we have is the name the underworld gave him, Kage. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Toshi. I have a bad feeling about this. Stain is a zealot, a mad dog. He's predictable in his madness. This Kage, he's cold, he's methodical. He's a surgeon. And I have no idea what his ultimate goal is. Is he cleaning up the streets? Or is he just another monster who happens to be pointing his claws at other monsters for now? From his apartment window, overlooking the glittering city, Toshinori Yagi felt a profound and terrible ache in his chest, right where his wound throbbed with the rhythm of his failing body. A highly skilled, quirkless vigilante with a ruthless streak and an encyclopedic knowledge of heroes and their weaknesses. It was a coincidence. It had to be, but as he stared out at the city he had sworn to protect, he couldn't shake the image of a tear-streaked, green-haired boy on a rooftop, his dreams crumbling to dust because of one tired, realistic word. No, he had never forgotten that boy's eyes. Eyes that held a fire he had foolishly, carelessly, tried to extinguish. He prayed to a god he didn't believe in that the embers of that fire hadn't been rekindled in the darkness. The warehouse was cold, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. Izuku clung to the rafters 30 feet above the floor, a spider in a concrete web. He was utterly still, his breathing slow and even, metered by the hiss of his mass filtration system. Below him, a deal was going down. His target tonight was not a villain, not in the traditional sense. It was a pro-hero named Buzzkill. His quirk allowed him to generate a debilitating bioelectric field, but it was short-range and took time to charge. He was a bottom feeder, a hero who supplemented his meager official income by moonlighting as hired muscle for a local Yakuza faction. Tonight, he was overseeing a weapons shipment. Izuku's analysis had been thorough. Buzzkill, heavily reliant on his quirk's reputation to intimidate. Actual combat skill is minimal. Vain. Prone to panic when his primary strategy fails. Electrical field is generated from nodes in his forearms. Protecting them is his top priority. The deal concluded. Crates of illegal firearms were exchanged for a briefcase full of cash. Buzzkill laughed with the Yakuza lieutenant, clapping the man on the back. It was a sickening sight. A hero, sworn to uphold the law, openly consorting with the very people he was supposed to be fighting. This was the rot. This was the disease. He waited until the lieutenant and most of his men had left, leaving Buzzkill with just 2 low-level guards. This was the moment. The point of maximum vulnerability. He didn't drop down with a dramatic flourish. He simply let go, his body plummeting in utter silence. He used the large stacks of crates to break his fall, his descent a controlled, noiseless slide. He was on the ground before any of them even knew he was there. One of the guards turned, a sixth sense making the hairs on his neck stand up. He saw nothing but shadows. Then a shadow detached itself from the others. Before the guard could even open his mouth to shout a warning, Izuku was on him. A swift, brutal chop to the side of the neck with the edge of his hand. The man crumpled without a sound. The second guard heard the soft thud of his partner's body. He spun around, raising his pistol. "Who's there?" A weighted, blunted knife flew out of the darkness, not at his chest, but at his wrist. It struck with the force of a hammer, shattering the bone and sending the gun clattering to the concrete floor. The man screamed, clutching his ruined hand. Before the scream had even peaked, Izuku was behind him, and a sharp blow to the back of the head silenced him. 2 down. It had taken less than 5 seconds. "Impressive," Buzzkill said, his voice tight with alarm. He had backed away, his hands raised, crackling arcs of blue electricity already dancing between his forearms. The ghost of the docks. Kaga, I've heard of you. Izuku said nothing. He emerged slowly from the shadows, his black mask and hooded green cloak making him look like something inhuman. He held a collapsed bow staff in each hand. The silence was his greatest psychological weapon. It unnerved his opponents, making them fill the void with their own fears. "You've made a big mistake coming after me, kid," Buzzkill blustered, his confidence a flimsy facade. "My quirk will fry your nervous system before you can even get close." Izuku began to walk towards him, his pace steady and unhurried. He had already factored the quirk into his calculations. The effective range was approximately 3 meters. The charge time from a cold start was 6 seconds. The hero's stance was wide-rooted. He was expecting a direct frontal assault. Predictable. At 5 meters, Izuku stopped. Buzzkill smirked. "That's right. Know your place." Izuku's hand blurred. He threw a smoke pellet. Not at Buzzkill, but at the floor between them. A thick, acrid cloud of black smoke erupted, instantly obscuring everything. Buzzkill coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. "Cheap tricks!" he yelled into the smoke. But Izuku was already gone. He hadn't charged forward. He had gone sideways. He ran, silent as a cat, along the edge of the smoke cloud, using it as a moving wall of cover. He circled around Buzzkill, whose attention was still focused on the spot where Izuku had been standing. He burst out of the smoke directly behind the hero. Buzzkill's eyes went wide with shock as he tried to turn. He was too slow. Izuku's bow staff snapped open with a sharp flick thwomp. He didn't aim for the head. He swung low, a vicious, targeted strike at the back of Buzzkill's left knee. The hero screamed as his leg hyperextended with a sickening pop, his knee joint giving way. He pitched forward, his quirk fizzling out as his concentration shattered. As Buzzkill fell, Izuku was already moving, his second staff striking the hero's right wrist with surgical precision. Another crack of bone. He had neutralized the target, his quirk, and his mobility in 3 fluid, brutal motions. The hero lay on the ground, moaning in agony, cradling his wrist and trying to straighten his ruined leg. He stared up at the silent, masked figure looming over him. "Why?" he gasped. Izuku finally spoke, his voice distorted by the mask's vocoder, making it sound cold, deep, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You wore the title of a hero. It was a privilege you abused. Now, it is a privilege you have lost." He knelt, pulling a heavy-duty zip tie from his vest and binding the hero's hands. He then took out a small, encrypted burner phone. He took several pictures, Buzzkill with the Yakuza, the illegal weapons, the briefcase of money. He uploaded them to a secure server, then sent an anonymous tip to a trusted journalist he knew would break the story wide open, bypassing the potentially corrupt police force. His work done, he turned to leave. He was about to melt back into the shadows when he paused. He walked over to one of the crates and pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled in foam, were dozens of advanced, military-grade assault rifles. Weapons that would have ended up on the streets, in the hands of criminals, causing untold death and misery. He looked at the broken hero, then at the guns. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He was just one person. A boy playing a deadly game in the dark. He could stop this one shipment. He could break this one corrupt hero. But the rot was deep. The system was vast. It was an endless, unwinnable war. He felt a surge of exhaustion, a profound and weary loneliness that cut deeper than any physical wound. He was utterly alone. He had no friends, no family to go home to. His only companion was a madman who thought killing was the only answer. He had sacrificed his name, his future, his very soul for this crusade. And for what? To make one tiny, insignificant scratch on the surface of an infinitely corrupt world? He stood there in the silence of the warehouse, surrounded by the evidence of his grim victory, and for the first time in a long time, the shadow felt less like a costume and more like a cage. He had power, he had purpose. But he had no light. And in the endless dark, he was beginning to forget what the sun even felt like. The news came not as a whisper on the wind, but as a guttural sneer in the dark. Stain had his ear to the grimy pulse of the underworld, A network of terrified informants and coerced contacts who fed him information like tithes to a wrathful god. He had been tracking the movements of a new, chaotic element in the city, a group of nihilistic villains who gathered under a banner of pure, anarchic destruction. They called themselves the League of Villains. They are insects. Stain spat, pacing the cramped confines of their hideout. His energy was a caged storm, making the small room feel even more claustrophobic. Children throwing a tantrum. They have no philosophy, no conviction. They mistake mayhem for a creed. They are an insult to the very concept of villainy. Izuku sat on the edge of his mattress, meticulously cleaning his collapsible bow staffs. He listened in silence, his focus absolute. He had learned that Stain's tirades were often the prelude to a new mission. He had been tracking the League himself, his own analysis aligning with Stain's. Their leader, a man-child with hands adorning his body named Tamura Shigaraki, seemed driven by a petty, video game-like desire to cause chaos for its own sake. They were sloppy, loud, and utterly without purpose. They were the antithesis of everything Stain, and by extension, Izuku, stood for. They planned to attack UA High School. Stain finally revealed, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial growl. Izuku's hands stilled. UA. The name was a phantom ache, a ghost of a life he would never lead. Their goal is as pathetic as their ideology. Stain continued, his disgust palpable. They intend to kill All Might. Izuku looked up, his gaze sharp and focused. All Might. The man who had crushed his dreams. The symbol of peace who had left him broken on a rooftop. He should have felt a sense of vindictive pleasure, a grim satisfaction that the pillar of the hero world was being targeted. But he didn't. He felt a cold, analytical dread. Stain saw the flicker of conflict in his eyes. Do not mistake my meaning, boy. All Might is the linchpin of this fraudulent society. His existence allows the weeds to grow in his shadow, but he himself, he is a true hero. He saves people with a smile, not for a paycheck. His conviction is absolute. He is worthy. Stain's twisted code of honor was a labyrinth Izuku had long since learned to navigate. To the hero killer, All Might was the one exception in a world of fakes, a genuine article whose presence accidentally propped up a corrupt system. Shigaraki and his band of thugs, on the other hand, were simply vermin. For these purposeless fools to lay their filthy hands on a true hero is a blasphemy. Stain declared, his eyes burning with righteous fury. An attack on Yurei is an attack on the very concept of heroism, twisted though their version of it may be. It is a line that will not be crossed. He turned his intense gaze on Izuku. And that is where you come in. Izuku already knew what was coming. This was not a standard mission. This was an intervention. The League will attack a first-year class during a training exercise at an off-campus facility known as the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ. Stain laid out the intelligence. They believe All Might will be present. Their plan is to use a creature, a Nomu, engineered specifically to kill him. Your mission is threefold. He held up one scarred finger. 1. You will infiltrate the USJ. Your skills in stealth and infiltration are paramount. You will be a ghost in their machine. A second finger joined the first. 2. You will protect the innocents. The students. They are unblooded, untested. They are children, not yet corrupted by the system they seek to join. They are non-combatants in this ideological war. You will ensure their survival. A third finger rose, and his voice dropped to a lethal whisper. 3. You will cull the weak. The villains. They are an infection with no purpose. You will dismantle them, show them the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their pathetic brand of chaos and our righteous conviction. Use non-lethal force, as is your preference. He added the last part with a hint of disdain, but be decisive. Be absolute. Let them know that a higher, more terrible form of justice is watching them. He paused, letting the weight of the mission settle on Izuku. This is not about saving the institution of UA. It is about protecting the idea of heroism, however flawed, from those who would mindlessly destroy it. It is about protecting the one true hero from a pack of rabid dogs. Do you understand your purpose? Izuku stood, his staffs now clean and reassembled. He gave a single, sharp nod. The irony was a bitter pill. A year ago, He would have done anything to get into UA. Now, he was being ordered to break into it, to act as a shadowy guardian for the very students whose lives he once envied. He was to be a hero in the one place that had decreed he could never be one. "I understand," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone, filtered through the memory of his training. He was Kage. And this was the hunt. The USJ was an architectural marvel, a colossal dome of geodesic glass that shimmered under the afternoon sun. From his vantage point in the wooded hills overlooking the facility, Izuku studied the layout through his binoculars, cross-referencing the view with the blueprints he had pulled from the city's planning commission database. He had memorized every corridor, every emergency exit, every environmental feature of the simulated disaster zones within. He was not going in blind. He was going into his own, pre-analyzed kill box. He saw the students of Class 1A arrive by bus, a vibrant, chattering group of teenagers in bright costumes. He recognized some of them from the sports festival broadcasts he had analyzed for Stain, the explosive anger of Bakugo, the icy calm of the boy with mismatched hair, Todoroki, the bubbly, round-faced girl, Uraraka. They were so young, so full of untested potential. They were walking into an ambush. He waited. Patience was a virtue Stain had beaten into him. He tracked the movements of the teachers, Eraserhead and 13, and noted with a cold certainty that All Might was not with them. The League's intelligence was flawed. Their primary target wasn't even here. This was going to be a massacre, but not the one the villains had planned. The air crackled. A swirling vortex of dark purple mist materialized in the central plaza of the facility, a wound opening in reality. From it, a tide of villains poured out, a motley collection of street thugs and low-level criminals, and leading them were the three figures he had identified from Stain's intel: the petulant man-child, Tamura Shigaraki, the misty warp-gate villain, Kurojairi, and the monster, the Nomu. It was a grotesque parody of a man, its muscles bulging to an unnatural degree, its skin a dark, purplish black. Its brain was exposed, encased in a bony shell, and its eyes were wide, vacant, and utterly devoid of intelligence. It stood with an unnatural stillness, a living weapon waiting for the command to kill. Eraserhead, pro-hero Shota Aizawa, reacted instantly, his capture weapon lashing out, his quirk-erasing gaze sweeping over the first wave of villains. He was a true professional, a master of his craft. Izuku had immense respect for him, having analyzed his fighting style for weeks. A formidable opponent. But he is one man against an army. As Aizawa engaged the main force, the Warpgate villain, Kurojairi, enveloped the students in his mist. "My apologies," his disembodied voice echoed through the dome. "Our business is with All Might, but if his students' deaths can draw him out, then so be it." Screams erupted as the students were scattered across the various disaster zones of the USJ. Kurojairi had separated them, divided them, made them vulnerable. This was his cue. Izuku donned his mask, the hiss of the filtration system a familiar prelude to violence. He pulled his green hood low and descended from the hills, a shadow moving through the trees. He didn't use the front door. He scaled the side of the dome, his reinforced gloves and boots finding purchase on the metal struts of the geodesic frame. He located a maintenance hatch near the apex of the dome, a detail he had noted in the blueprints. A moment's work with a pry bar and he was inside, clinging to the high-tension cables that crisscrossed the ceiling, 100 feet above the chaos. From his perch, he was a silent, unseen god, surveying the battlefield. He could see it all: Aizawa, already becoming overwhelmed in the plaza, 13, trying to protect the remaining students at the entrance, and the scattered pockets of students, fighting for their lives in the zones below. The mission was clear. Protect the innocents. Cull the weak. His first target was the shipwreck zone. He saw 3 students there, a frog-like girl, a tiny boy with purple spheres on his head, and himself. No, not himself. A green-haired boy in a suit that looked like a clumsy imitation of All Might. This must be the one who had taken his place. The one who had received the hero's favor. A bitter taste filled Izuku's mouth, but he pushed it down. Sentiment was a weakness. The mission was all that mattered. A group of villains with aquatic quirks were closing in on their boat, their intent murderous. The 3 students were terrified, outmatched. Izuku didn't hesitate. He ran along a high catwalk, his movements silent and sure-footed. Finding his position directly above the water, he detached two weighted, blunted throwing knives from his vest. He didn't aim to cripple, just to disrupt. He threw them. The knives fell like twin meteors, striking the water on either side of the villain's ringleader, a shark-faced man. The impacts were concussive, sending up geysers of water and disorienting the attackers. For a vital second, their attention was drawn upwards. It was all the frog girl, Tsuyu Azuri, needed. Using her tongue, she launched the tiny boy Mineta into the air. He unleashed his quirk, his sticky purple spheres raining down into the water, turning the surface into an inescapable trap. Then, the other boy, the one who looked like a cheap imitation of Izuku's old dreams, flicked his finger, unleashing a shockwave of force that created a whirlpool, sucking the trapped villains into a single, incapacitated mass. They had saved themselves. But it had been his intervention, his momentary distraction, that had given them the opening. From the boat, Tsuyu looked up, her large eyes scanning the catwalks. "Did you guys see that? Something fell. Who cares? We're alive!" Mineta cried, sobbing with relief. The other boy, the one with the green lightning crackling around him, stared up into the darkness of the domed ceiling, a deep frown on his face. He felt it. A presence. Something watching. Izuku had already moved on. He swept through the facility like a wraith. In the ruins zone, a group of villains had cornered the spiky red-haired boy, Kirishima, and another student he didn't recognize. Izuku, from a vantage point on a collapsed building, used a small, powerful slingshot and a handful of ball bearings to shatter the lights above them, plunging the area into darkness. In the ensuing confusion, Kirishima hardened his body and charged, his straightforward attack proving devastatingly effective against the disoriented thugs. He was a force multiplier, an unseen hand tipping the scales. He never engaged directly, never revealed his presence. He was a ghost, a rumor, a sudden gust of wind that turned the tide of a fight. He saw students with powerful quirks, the engine-legged boy Ida, the stoic, ice-wielding Todoroki, and he left them to their own devices, focusing his efforts on the weaker, more vulnerable students who had been isolated. His path inevitably led him to the conflagration zone. And to him, Katsuki Bakugo was a whirlwind of explosions and rage. He was fighting alongside Kirishima, the two of them a surprisingly effective team of offense and defense. Bakugo was a natural combatant, his instincts honed and lethal. But he was also reckless, leaving his back exposed as he blasted his way through a crowd of villains. A villain with a chameleon quirk materialized behind him, a long, sharp knife in his hand, ready to plunge it into Bakugo's spine. Izuku was perched on a nearby scaffold. His mind worked in fractions of a second. Bakugo's focus is forward. Kirishima is engaged. The threat is immediate. Lethal force intended. He pulled one of his collapsible staffs from his belt. He didn't have time for a ranged attack. He had to be closer. He leaped from the scaffold, his cloak billowing behind him, and landed on a shipping container directly behind the invisible villain. The landing was featherlight. Bakugo, sensing a shift in the air, glanced over his shoulder. "What are you bastards waiting for?" he roared. The chameleon villain lunged. At the same instant, Izuku's staff snapped to its full length. He swung it in a low, horizontal arc, not at the villain's body, but at his ankles. The steel bar connected with a solid crack. The villain cried out, his invisibility faltering as pain overwhelmed his concentration, and he tumbled to the ground, his attack ruined. It all happened in the space of a heartbeat. Bakugo's crimson eyes widened, not at the defeated villain, but at the figure who had saved him. The figure was tall and lean, clad in dark, functional gear. A black mask covered the lower half of his face, and a tattered green hood cast his eyes in shadow. He moved with a terrifying, silent grace that spoke of endless, brutal training. But it wasn't the costume or the skill that made Bakugo's breath catch in his throat. It was the way he stood. The subtle posture. The analytical tilt of his head. The familiar shock of unruly green hair visible under the hood. It was a ghost from his past, remade into something dark and unrecognizable. Deku? The name was a whisper of disbelief, laced with a decade of derision. Izuku Kage stood over the groaning villain, his staff held at the ready. He met Bakugo's astonished gaze. For a single, charged moment, the chasm of a year vanished. He was no longer a vigilante. Bakugo was no longer a hero in training. They were just Izuku and Kaken, two boys locked in a history of pain and envy. Izuku's grip on his staff tightened. He could say 1,000 things. He could mock him, could finally throw all of Bakugo's taunts back in his face. He could reveal the story of his descent and transformation. Instead, he did what Stain had taught him. He erased himself. He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Then, with a fluid motion, he disarmed the downed villain, kicked his knife away, and vaulted backwards, using the shipping container as a springboard to propel himself back up into the labyrinthine rafters of the dome. He disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. "Hey! Get back here!" Bakugo roared, a mixture of rage and utter confusion on his face. He took a step to follow, but Kirishima grabbed his arm. "Whoa, Bakugo, who was that?" Kirishima asked, his eyes wide. "He just saved your life. Seemed like a pro on our side." Bakugo stared up into the darkness where the figure had vanished, his mind reeling. It couldn't be. Quirkless, useless Deku? Fighting like that? Moving like that? It was impossible. And yet, he knew, on a primal, instinctual level, he knew. The shadow that had just saved him was the very same one he had spent his entire life trying to step on. Back in the central plaza, the situation had grown dire. Aizawa, despite his incredible skill, was being worn down. Shigaraki and the monstrous Nomu had entered the fray. The students watched in horror as the creature caught Aizawa, breaking his bones with sickening crunches, grinding his face into the pavement. Izuku saw it all from his perch. He felt a cold, professional fury. Aizawa was a true hero, a warrior fighting against impossible odds to protect his students. To see him broken by this mindless beast, it was an obscenity. Then, the doors to the USJ burst open. And there, standing in the sunlight, was All Might. His face was not smiling. It was a mask of cold, righteous rage. "I am here." The battle that followed was legendary. All Might versus the Nomu. It was a titanic clash of unstoppable force against an immovable object. The Nomu's quirks, shock absorption and super regeneration, were specifically designed to counter All Might. The hero was being pushed to his absolute limit. Izuku watched with the detached eye of an analyst. He saw what the others didn't. He saw the slight flicker in the Nomu's movements when it took a blow to the same spot twice. He saw the way its regeneration slowed, just for a microsecond, when it had to heal multiple wounds at once. But most importantly, he saw the exposed brain. It had to be a weak point. An Achilles heel. But it was too well protected. All Might was being crushed, the Nomu's grip squeezing the life out of him, digging into his old wound. He was weakening. The students tried to intervene, Bakugo, Kirishima, Todoroki, and the new green-haired boy, but they were brushed aside. They were children trying to stop an earthquake. All Might was going to lose. The symbol of peace was going to die, here, in front of his students. Stain's order echoed in his mind. Protect the true hero. Izuku knew he couldn't fight the Nomu head-on. That was suicide. But he was an analyst. He was a creature of the environment. He looked up, not at the fight, but at the dome above it. High above the plaza, a massive bank of theatrical spotlights hung from the ceiling, each one the size of a small car, used to simulate daylight in the dome. They were directly over the fight. He had noted their structural integrity when he'd first entered. The support struts were strong, but there was one maintenance junction, right where the primary support beam met the ceiling frame, that looked corroded. It was an insane gamble. A 1-in-a-million shot. He had a small amount of plastic explosive in his vest, used for breaching doors. It wouldn't be enough to sever the beam, but it might be enough to shatter the rusted, corroded junction point. He had to create a diversion. He had to give All Might an opening. He scrambled along the catwalks until he was in position. He planted the small charge on the corroded joint, the wind from the blows below making the entire structure tremble. He set the timer for 5 seconds. He looked down. All Might was struggling, his strength fading. The Nomu was preparing for a final, crushing blow. Now, he armed the charge and launched himself off the catwalk, using his wire launcher to swing away towards a safer position. The explosion was not large, but it was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't a boom, it was a sharp, high-pitched crack, like a giant bone snapping. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the main support beam for the lighting rig buckled. The entire massive structure, weighing several tons, tilted and then plunged downwards. It wasn't aimed at the Nomu. That would have been too risky, too likely to hit All Might or the students. It was aimed at the spot 10 feet to the Nomu's left. The goal was not to crush. It was to distract. The world devolved into chaos. The lighting rig crashed into the plaza with the force of a meteor, shattering the stone floor and sending up a massive cloud of dust and debris. The noise was apocalyptic. The Nomu, for all its power, was still a creature of instinct. The sudden, overwhelming sensory input, the sound, the shockwave, the debris, startled it. For a single, critical second, its head whipped towards the source of the crash, its vacant eyes bewildered. Its grip on All Might loosened by a fraction. It was the opening of a lifetime. All Might saw it. He felt the shift in pressure. He didn't know where the explosion had come from, but he knew a gift from the heavens when he saw one. He roared, a sound of pure, indomitable will, and unleashed everything he had left. Go beyond! Plus. Ultra! He threw a punch so powerful it broke the sound barrier. Then another. And another. A furious, impossible barrage of blows that struck the Nomu with the force of artillery shells. He wasn't just hitting it. He was overloading its ability to absorb, to regenerate. He drove it back, punch by punch, until he delivered the final, cataclysmic blow that launched the monster out of the USJ entirely, sending it tumbling into the sky. The silence that followed was absolute. All Might stood, steam pouring off his body, his form flickering dangerously. He had won. He had pushed past his limit and saved the day. As the dust began to settle, he looked up, trying to find the source of the explosion. And he saw him. On a distant, damaged catwalk, silhouetted against the shattered glass of the dome, stood a figure. A dark, hooded form. The setting sun, streaming through the new hole in the roof, caught the edges of his green hair, making it glow like a halo. All Might's eyes widened. His mind, reeling from exhaustion and victory, struggled to process the image. The figure was too far away to see clearly, but the posture, the green hair, it was unmistakable. He was instantly transported back a year, to a rooftop, to a desperate, quirkless boy, the vigilante the police were calling Kage. The ruthless, analytical phantom who crippled villains and heroes alike. It was him, the boy he had rejected. The boy he had told to be realistic. He had just saved All Might's life. The realization struck Toshinori Yagi with more force than any of the Noma's punches. The regret was a physical, crushing weight, so immense it almost brought him to his knees. His words hadn't extinguished that boy's fire. They had just forced it to burn in the dark. And it had been forged into something sharp, something dangerous, something utterly unrecognizable. What have I done? Up on the catwalk, Aizawa, his body a mangled wreck but his spirit unbroken, was also stirring. He saw the figure. You! He rasped, trying to push himself up. Who are you? He tried to activate his quirk, but his eyes were swollen shut. Izuku Kage looked down at the scene. He saw the defeated villains, the terrified but safe students, the victorious but dangerously weakened symbol of peace. His mission was complete. He met All Might's gaze across the ruined expanse of the USJ. He didn't know what the hero could see from that distance, but he held the look for a long moment, a silent, damning indictment. Then he turned, and with the fluid grace of a creature born to the shadows, he vanished into the broken superstructure of the dome, leaving behind a battlefield of questions and one hero's profound, soul-shattering regret.